Basically, I'd like to start out from a moral perspective. That's always been my concern with human trafficking. It's my concern with most everything. Back when I was in college, I joined a social fraternity, Delta Upsilon, and its motto is the Chi Iupa Theta, and that means justice, our foundation. And I've taken that seriously all my life. I know it's hard to believe that from 20 years old I was worried about justice, but I've always thought that injustice is the greatest harm to the human condition. Injustice is kind of shorthand for all the nasty things we do to each other. And the human condition is slowly but surely being discovered by humanity, and mostly through the work of Christianity, Judeo-Christian, Western culture. You look in other, and I'm going to unabashedly say this, you rarely find true injustice and true inhumanity in a Western culture. You find lots and lots of evil, because we're human, but you rarely find organized, governmental assisted, NGO level injustice. And an injustice in this world is human trafficking. That is one of the greatest. One of the reasons that the free market works so well is because every person in here is a corporate human being. They have 24 hours in a day, and you more or less, thereabouts, roundabout, have 24 hours in a day. Human trafficking cuts that 24 hours down to zero. It's not their time. Therefore, it is not their life. You steal a human life when you traffic a human. That's what slavery is. Slavery is that profoundly evil. You have murdered them and then took their labor from them. And there they are. They're basically zombies. You've taken away every bit of free will they have, and that is the highest crime. So slavery is really what we're talking about here. Now, you can picture an 1830s plantation with some black dude and a collar around his neck chained to a tree. That is slavery. But nowadays, they're more clever. They've taken the collar off, they've changed the colors around, and they don't keep them on plantations anymore. But they are slaves. Not a minute of their day is theirs, nor do they get paid for it. Slavery. Human trafficking is slavery. So that's kind of the justice part, and I got that off my chest, and I feel better. So, when I went to the State Department, the very first thing someone said to me was Dr. Stanley Fraley, who's the Director of Nuclear Affairs down at the Department of State. I was Special Assistant for the President down there. And he looked at my resume, and he literally did this. He goes, "Oh, Mr. Samarrai, what about your English degree brings you here to Nuclear Affairs?" Well, sir, I don't know. And he assigned me a Marine captain and told the two of us, go learn how to build a bomb. Come back in about 3 months. And we went out and we put together this giant matrix. And there are so many steps to building a nuclear weapon. And when I came back and I was good and proficient at building nuclear devices, we started in on investigating proliferation. And that's the PSI, the George Bush's PSI. That's the Non-Proliferation Security Initiative. And we were basically in charge of that. And on the upper left-hand corner, which is the least important corner on a matrix, really, there was uranium mining. And they gave that to me. I was the low guy on it. I mean, missiles and nuclear devices and AQ Khan over in Pakistan. All that sexy stuff was given to the real people. And I was given, go look at uranium mines. So I pulled the intel and I started reading up on uranium mines, and a certain renegade nation was having very little trouble making yellow cake, which is the next step in making your fuel type uranium. And it's like, how does this nasty little country with no technology pull off this really nice yellow cake? It's the good stuff. And so we sent our guys out, we investigated. Finally, we realized through chemical analysis and stuff that this uranium was coming from a closed mine. We had a deal with an African country that they would plug their mines, and by plug, they poured hundreds of cubic yards of cement down the tunnels of these things, and they were plugged. But if you look at a satellite photograph, there are villages around these mine openings, and what they had done was basically burrowed around the plug. And believe me, OSHA was not in charge of these mines. There were cave-ins, uranium dust, mostly men working there, and they were all dying of cancer. So we sent the World Health Organization out there. What on earth is going out there? This country is telling us this is a farming community. They all happen to be around these mines. Don't see any farming, and everyone's dying of tumors. When we finally figured out what was going on, that's when I got introduced to slavery. This country was in the Civil War, and they would go down into the villages of some tribe that wasn't theirs, snatch all these young men, and force them into digging with absolutely no protective equipment, uranium. And it was of such high degree, they actually were getting radioactive damage to their body from being in the mine as opposed to just smelling, inhaling the dust. So they were getting a double whammy, and they were dying at a frightening level. So I was introduced to slave grounds. Slaves. Nobody has slaves. And I went down and I found out that there is an entire bureau in the Department of State, and it's for human trafficking. And there's another whole bureau too, it's for labor, and those two have something to do with each other as well. So I went down there and I cross-trained with the human trafficking people to better identify this, because if I was going to be looking at uranium mines, I needed to know what to look for. And there's dozens of uranium mines. You've heard of blood diamonds? Slavery. You've heard of gold down in South Africa? Slavery. You've heard of the copper mines in Central Africa? Slavery. You've heard of the emerald mines in Peru? Slavery. You've heard of the opal mines in Venezuela and down Bolivia and those areas. I think that's where the opal comes from. Slavery. You've heard of the fish farms in Nigeria. Slavery. You've heard of the factory cities in China. Slavery. Everybody here is probably wearing an article of clothing made by a slave. Probably. This mic was probably made by a slave. If it says made in China, damn good chance it's made by a slave. And that brings up the labor side. Slavery is so pernicious and so evil that to have any amount of it in one spot to make an article, basically a factory city in, let's say, China. They go into the villages, and there are a lot of villages. China is not a modern country. And they go into the villages and they snatch all the girls because there's really no life out there. Their family has been there for the last 1,000 years, and that's that. It's not the workers' paradise. And they snatch all these girls with a promise of good pay. They can send the cash back to these poverty villages, and they can live in a city. Shiny lights of the city. It's different from the dirt roads of the village. Let's go. And they show up, and they're charged room and board. You get so much as a sip out of the water fountain, you're charged. You miss so much as a half hour, you're charged. You get sick, you're charged. And by the time all is said and done, you owe the company money. So you actually need a second job to pay for your first one, but the problem is you work 18-hour days, and you're given maybe 4 days a year off, and that's the Chinese New Year. And you don't have enough money or enough time to get back to your village. So you spend it in the city. And you spend that time in the city because it's a festival and lots of people come into the cities for festivals, turning tricks so that you can pay back the money you owe. This is the evil of slavery. So when you have factories that basically have driven the cost of labor, and basically the international average of labor has been depressed by Southeast Asians, these factories, and those groups and that whole area down there. When the value of labor is zero to make a product, it bends the entire economic curve in the world, because we are a global market now. When you bend the entire economic curve in the world, those of us who wear cheap clothing enjoy a higher lifestyle. And when that labor ends, and it will, because those people will revolt and China will be tossed into chaos, because there's only so long you can oppress 1 billion people and put 100,000 women in a factory and say, y'all working for free until you fall over and die. There's only so long that can happen. When that labor market ends, and it's going to be somewhat picked up by the Vietnams and the Laos and the Burmas and other, Indonesia and stuff like that. But that's a far more diffused, less populated areas, and they're easier to watch, and they're not as closed. So you're going to see the cost of labor in the world rise. Now, just as an example, when someone in a factory across the Pacific Ocean can create a knickknack for $1 that you find in the dollar store, pack it on a cargo barge, ship it to the United States, disperse it over one of the largest continents in the world, and you can still buy it for $1. You know that the labor market has been bent severely. You should not be able to buy something from China for $1. I don't care how small it is. And that's the problem. When that goes south, and it will, count on it, China is not a stable nation. They put down 150 revolts a day. Read the papers, get online, look up Chinese revolts. Okay, if y'all remember that one guy stopping a tank in Tiananmen Square, there are millions of brave Chinese like that. And the government is terrified. George Bush asked the president of China one day, what keeps you up at night? And he said, finding 200,000 jobs a month. That's the American job market right there. This guy's got to find enough people to employ that the United States could employ in a year. They have 1 billion people to keep subjugated. And that's how they do it, is through the labor markets, bringing in enough money to pay for enough guns to keep these slaves in place. That is it. That's what's going on. And in other countries, go to Africa, you'll see the same thing. So that's the perspective on the labor, the big, giant global perspective on the labor market. It is being bent by slavery, and we are going to suffer for it one day. Our standard of living is going to get a really good kick in the rear when all these markets suddenly go off, either off the grid, or they start actually making what they earn. And so that is what I did. I cross-trained over there, and I learned all this, and I came back, joined the Institute with Dr. Smith and all these good people, and I kept talking about slavery. People look at me like I'm insane. I go on the radio and talk about it, and I get baffled looks. People don't think slavery exists. There literally are slaves in Florida. Generally in the domestic services and in the agricultural fields in this state, but you can find them for other reasons. You can find most of them in this state in the domestic services at foreign national homes. Now these people look like real people. They have visas, and they have green cards, and they have all kinds of identification, and that's Carlos, and that's Juanita. That's them. Certainly is, no doubt about it. And they live over in the Brazilian attachés or the Argentinian cultural charge d'affaires or something like that. And it all looks copacetic and kosher and very cool because, you have to understand, South Florida is the capital of the Southern Hemisphere. Okay, it's in the crossroads of Central and South America and in the shipping lanes of Africa. See, a lot of people don't understand why we're the third largest destination for human trafficking is because the state of Florida is a mega state. It is a nation state. If the state of Florida were a nation, it would be the 15th richest nation on the planet. The state of Florida can raise and fund a militia large enough to defeat every nation south of Texas. Okay? The economy of Florida is twice the size of Sweden's. We are a nation state. We are powerful. We are rich. And this brings in that kind of behavior. We have open ports. We have open borders. We have a lot of stuff going on that allows this kind of behavior. And you can get rich running people for free. If I could get everybody in this room here to work for me for free, I would retire inside of a year. Okay, and the only way I'm going to get that with this crowd is probably to enslave you, because my charming personality sure won't do it. But you have to understand that is where it's coming from. Slavery makes people a lot of money, and when there's a lot of money in a nation state the size and wealth of Florida, that's where it comes. That's why it's here. And the lifestyle you guys enjoy is supported to some great percent by the slave labor and the indentured servitude of others in other third world countries. This is something we all need to understand and we all need to know. Think of it as a labor issue, think of it as a human condition issue, and think of it as very simply evil. And it must be stopped, and we need to get to it. And that's why we're here today. Thank you.